Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and turn on notifications so that you don't miss any conversations. Well, I'm really excited to share this week's conversation with all of you that I got to have with Dr. John Marriott. He's a professor at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, a faculty affiliate at Harvard University's Human Flourishing Program, and an author of 5 books on deconversion and deconstruction. He wrote his dissertation on Christian deconversion to atheism, and he's just studied so much on this topic of deconstruction and deconversion. And he joined me on the podcast to chat about that topic and his newest book that he co-authored with Sean McDowell. That book is Set Adrift, Deconstructing What You Believe Without Sinking Your Faith. Now, I personally was really excited to pick John's brain because I read his book and as we were looking for resources for the series that we're in right now about deconstruction. And I really love the principles that it set up for understanding why you might be deconstructing and how to do it with this goal of having a more authentic and vibrant faith. Now, we're actually splitting the interview into 2 parts. And in the first half of the conversation, we talk about, hey, how do you respond when someone tells you that they're deconstructing? We go over some key principles that you might share with the person in that process and understanding why your own motives for deconstructing are so important. This is my conversation with John. Well, hi, John. Thanks for coming on the Ridge podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I appreciate your interest.
Yeah, I mean, it was awesome. I read your most recent book, and it was so good and so enlightening as we've kind of been going through this series as a church on deconstruction. And it just came out, which was really good timing. I'm curious. You've written 5 books on deconversion and deconstruction, and this whole process. I mean, your dissertation, right, is on the deconversion to atheism. What is it about this topic that makes it so important to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really glad that you guys are talking about this because it's an incredibly relevant issue. The numbers of people who are walking away from the faith and saying, I no longer identify as a Christian are off the charts now. Yeah. Of course, we can ask who these people are. What was their level of commitment? Did they ever really know the Lord? Those are all really important questions. But one of the things that all the statistics point to is that there is this sort of tsunami of deconversions going on. Yeah. And so what prompted me to get into researching that? And that was really an experience I had with somebody who was very meaningful to me, someone who was a hero of mine, both an athletic hero and a spiritual hero. And one day I went online and started reading about him, wondering where he was these days and what he was up to. And he's a fairly well-known personality, and found out that he no longer identified as a Christian anymore. And this was a really significant person for me that came along at a point in my life when I was wrestling with just some hard things that I was going through, and meant a lot to me. And had a really public Christian testimony, and then said, I don't think I believe in God anymore. And then, of course, that means that Jesus isn't who he claimed to be in the Bible, and renounced it. And then to top it all off, he said, and I'm happier and more content with myself now than I ever was as a Christian. And I thought, man, how did that happen? And when I started looking into his story, I found out that he is, for every celebrity deconversion that happens, there are just thousands of other people who have walked away from the faith, who are just less known, but are still willing to post their stories online and explain why they're no longer Christians. And so I said, I'd like to get to the bottom of this and or at least sort of plumb some of the depths of it. And that's what spurred me on to do my PhD doctoral dissertation was in people who left the faith.
So I'm curious. I'm sure that people listening right now, they know people, big people in their lives, maybe even very similar story to you, where they were really influential in their own faith. When you heard that, how did that affect your own faith?
You, I've wrestled with questions for a really long time,
Yeah.
probably just out of a sense of insecurity, maybe lack of self-confidence. I was always sensitive to objections that other people would raise. My own mind would raise its own objections.
Yeah.
So I've thought about these things for a really long time. When I heard about this person leaving, the reasons why they left, I did not find very threatening. But that
Mm,
somebody who was apparently so committed and had
yeah.
sacrificed and genuinely believed, at least intellectually so,
Yeah.
was able to walk away from their faith when they had taken such a public stand for so many years
Yeah.
was deeply troubling to me.
Yeah.
And then when I started interviewing people who had done the same thing, I came
Mm,
across a few people who I felt sort of a kinship with. These were
mm,
people who had similar stories to mine and had similar struggles to mine. And then that made me wonder, are these people just being more intellectually virtuous than I am and following their doubts to their true conclusion?
yeah.
And am I just looking for confirmation bias? And am I
Yeah.
just hoping that what I believe is true and closing my eyes to the contrary evidence? That those people were the ones who really made me wrestle through whether or not I really believed what I thought that I did, and why did I believe it.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate there's a lot of like intellectual honesty that has to happen with those conversations and those thoughts. And so I think that that's such a valuable process and thing to even be considering those things ahead of time instead of just kind of reacting to them. I want to chat a little bit about your book. So it's Set Adrift, Deconstructing What You Believe Without Sinking Your Faith. And you co-wrote it with Sean McDowell. And I remember just in the one of the first lines in the book, the first in the beginning, you're talking to a college student, right? And they tell you, "I hope we can talk about deconstructing my faith." So you start chatting with student. I'm sure as a professor, you mentioned in the book, you've had many of these types of conversations. In that moment, how do you respond?
Well, I was caught a little off guard, but
Yeah.
by the way, this is a great question because I
Yeah.
think how you respond can really set the tone for how things move forward in any kind of a relationship. I was caught off guard because her name was Maggie, was in an introduction to philosophy and aesthetics class. So right, we're talking about what is beauty and what is
Yeah.
art, and she wanted to talk to me after class, and so we set up a time. And I thought she was going to talk about something philosophical that had to do with art and
Yeah.
beauty because that was her major. And then she said that she was deconstructing, and I wasn't really prepared for that conversation. I had
Yeah.
to sort of shift gears mentally. But I think that there's a lot of those conversations that come up that we're not really prepared for. When someone
Yeah.
says, I'm either rethinking what I believe or I am wondering whether I believe it at all. And maybe now is a good time to make the distinction between deconstruction and deconversion.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're used
Yeah.
synonymously, but
Yeah.
I think it's
Please.
probably helpful to make a distinction. Someone who is deconstructing their faith, it can mean a number of different things. And for some people, it is I've kind of just I don't really believe this anymore, and now I'm going to take it apart and pull it apart and show you why I don't believe it. I've deconstructed it,
Yeah.
and that's not what we're talking about in the book. When we write about deconstruction, we're talking about the person who says, "Look, I believe that Jesus is the way, but I'm just not sure what the way of Jesus looks like anymore. I've been
Yeah.
handed a version of Christianity, and I'm realizing that maybe it's not the pure, unadulterated, unadorned, dropped from the sky interpretation of what the way of Jesus looks like. I
Yeah.
come from a tradition and a family and a church, and so what is essential? And if I really want to follow Jesus well, what can I let go of, and what can I adopt? But what do I need to hold on to be a faithful follower of Jesus?" That's the kind of deconstruction we're talking about. Deconversion would be when someone really kind of, in a way, um, undoes their conversion experience. And by that, I'm not talking about, they become unregenerate or unjustified. I'm just
Sure.
meaning they renounce the commitment that they once made.
Yeah.
They say, I no longer believe this is true. Not I'm wrestling with what it should look like, but I don't think that it's true. And they withdraw from being part of the community. Now, deconstruction certainly can lead to deconversion. That happens. And I think everyone who has deconverted would probably say they deconstructed first.
Yeah.
So I think for those folks, maybe apologetics and some apologetics answers might be maybe pertinent. For the people that we wrote the book for, were people like Maggie, who says, look, I want to follow Jesus. I want to be faithful, but I've been handed this version of Christianity and it's very unappealing to me. So what needs to be recalibrated? My intuitive sense of what's appealing, or the version of Christianity that I've been handed, or maybe both in some kind of way.
Yeah.
And so when anyone asks those kinds of questions, I think it's very easy to if you're the one on the other end of the question, or you're the one they're confiding in, to feel a great sense of panic.
Yeah.
To feel a sense of, I have to do something here. This person is leaving their faith. They're walking away. They're leaving our team. I have to stop it. I have to do something. My daughter, when she was 11 years old, one night, she said, Dad, I don't think I believe in heaven. And when she told that to me, it was sort of like she was going to bed. I was putting her to bed, and she said, I'm afraid to tell you this because I know it's going to make you feel bad. And I said, well, you can tell me. She said, I don't think I believe in heaven. Now, her grandfather had just passed away. And so that got her thinking about heaven. And with everything in me, I wanted to start asking her, well, what do you mean you don't believe in heaven?
Yeah.
And give her all
Here's
these
the laundry list of reasons why you should. And yeah.
And so, but instead, I paused and took a deep breath. And then I went through what later I've kind of cataloged as maybe a helpful way to respond. So I know this is a bit of a long answer, but the first thing I think that we need to do is to pause and to not panic. The second thing we need to do is to be genuinely thankful and express gratitude to someone who is really going through something hard, and thank them for being willing to share and to be open and to come forward with something that really goes to the core of who we are, right? Our existential questions, our identity, who are we, our community, all of this is up in the air when these questions start to really flood our minds. The last thing that anyone needs is for someone to scold them, for someone to tell them that they shouldn't be having these, to tell them that they should just be having more faith. The most important thing I think that you can do is communicate, gratitude for being willing to share, an unconditional love for them, regardless of where they end up, and then be willing to really listen well. And then when it's appropriate, ask some helpful clarifying questions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that just feels like you prove yourself worthy of being a part of that process for that person, right? Instead of like it's almost like a little mini test of like, can I trust you with this conversation? Can you be a part of this process? Or are you going to be like the person yelling at me on the street saying, if you don't follow this subset of Christianity that I've deemed appropriate, you don't actually follow Jesus, Yeah.
And that happens a lot. That happens a lot. I hear from a lot of people, and there's a lot of stories, a lot of online sort of deconversion testimonies of people who will say, I couldn't ask questions, or I raised questions and I was told that I needed to have more faith and that I wasn't really being a believer if I expressed any kind of doubt, which is just crazy, I think. And the most unhelpful thing that almost anyone could ever do is to shut down someone's genuine, sincere questioning, especially when, doubting Thomas isn't even doubting Thomas. He's unbelieving Thomas. He says, I will not believe until I can put my fingers in his hands and in his side. And what does Jesus do? He shows up and he offers him his hands and his side, right? He doesn't scold him, but he tries to address the questions and the struggle that he was having. He didn't tell him that he didn't have any faith. and that he just needed to believe more. And so I think we really need to try and not panic, to offer gratitude for being the person that they're willing to talk with, to express unconditional acceptance and love for wherever they land on this journey, to listen really well, and then when it's appropriate, to ask some clarifying questions.
Okay, so you go through that process. You take your time. You listen. You truly affirm. You're grateful for being a part of the process, and then you start laying off, your questions. And I mean, I'm sure that it's tempting. You wrote this book that's this whole guide on how to go through this process. It's like, hey, here, read this. But like in that conversation or as you're going through, are there like maybe some key things, talking points you'd bring up in that conversation?
Yeah, and there are. I think that there are some that I have in the back of my mind. There are also some that will come from listening to the conversation. Right? We always want to love well because it's just the right thing to do. It's not a tactic to get an ear. It's not trying to be able to get some leverage or try and win some favor. We really want to love them. And Jesus tells us that we should love our enemies. So how much more should we love someone who is a believer, but who's wrestling and struggling, right? And affirming them and hearing them and empathizing with them at times as well isn't being unfaithful to Jesus, and it's not betraying his lordship in our life. It's really loving them really well. And out of that, there might be questions that will come up and that will be appropriate. So I think everyone has a different experience. And so everyone will have maybe different questions that are appropriate to respond to. But some of the ones that I would be thinking of would be, so are you really wrestling with whether or not Christianity is true, or are you wrestling with whether or not the version that you have is reflective of the way of Jesus? And that's a fundamental question, because how you answer that will really determine, or how a person answers that will determine how the rest of, I think, the conversation and the relationship will go. So if my friend says, Maggie, she says, well, the college student, she says, well, I believe in Jesus and I believe the Bible's God's word, but I'm really struggling with these. And she listed off a handful of things that she was wrestling with. And for that, I think, okay, so she's within the faith. These aren't questions that are going to cause her to leave the faith.
Yeah.
And that would be the first thing I think to discover. Are you wrestling with the veracity and the truth of Christianity, or are you wrestling with the version that you've been given? The second thing I think that I would want to know is, and you can usually pick this up from the conversation, is really what brought this on. Because there's always a catalyst or a combination of things that become the catalyst. And sometimes for some people, it's just straight up intellectual. They have had a good experience in the church. They come from a family that has modeled loving them well, but they end up coming across things in the Bible and they say, I just don't understand how this can be true.
Yeah.
Or they come across some real major objections. The internet has really leveled the playing field as far as other side and anti-apologists or atheist apologists, raising lots of troubling questions for Christians. And you'd want to be able to know, is that where it's coming from? Or is it started with something else? Is it started with something that's more emotional? Is it a bad experience that you've had? Do you feel betrayed by God because you've lived in such a way that you feel as though you've done what he wants, but something really important you wanted in life came along and you had been praying for that and trusting God for that, and then it fell through and you feel a little bit betrayed by God because he didn't hold up his end of the bargain? Or is it values related, right? Do you just come to the text? And I think this is the most significant issue that motivates most, I want to be careful how I say this, but many young people today is, I have certain values. I'm very inclusive. I really think that we should be accepting and loving of everyone. And my church and my tradition, and actually historic Orthodox Christianity, has always said that there's a particular sexual ethic that LGBTQ behavior, at least, falls outside of. And I really struggle with that. I don't know how I can affirm historic Orthodox Christianity and at the same time live up to the values that I think are really important.
Yeah.
So depending on where the deconstruction problem starts, I think will be really crucial in knowing how then to follow up and what to talk about.
I think, I want to get back to the value thing in a second because you got some. My favorite chapter in the book is talking about the value elements, but one of the themes that I found kind of running through the whole book, and I think goes into this line of questioning, is what somebody's motive behind deconstruction. You talk a lot about how do you identify your own personal motives, and so I'm curious, why is that a key element? Like, why did that become a theme as part of your book? That it's like important to realize what your real motives are.
Yeah, that came out of a conversation that I never actually had, but was invited into by a former Biola student who had left
Mm-hmm.
the faith. And he emailed me and said, I want to sit down and talk to you. And I'm going to tell you why I left. And I want you to tell me why you remain a Christian.
Hmm.
And so I was thinking about that quite a bit. Like, how would I answer that question? And to be honest, years ago, I would have answered that question very easily and would have been very happy to have that conversation. And I would have just said, because Christianity is the most rational of all worldviews, and it has the best evidence, and it answers the big questions of life far better than any other worldview out there. And so it was an intellectual, heady kind of a decision.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't answer that question that way anymore, because I think that while that's part of why I'm a Christian, there are all kinds of other factors that are operating, sometimes off the radar of my conscious awareness,
Sure.
that influence significantly why I believe certain things and why I do certain things. And so I think our motives for why we do what we do are pretty complex.
Hmm.
I think that we're prone to self-deception, giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt where maybe we ought not to at times. I think that we all, when it comes to issues that touch the core of who we are, our identity, how we're going to live our lives, I think all of those areas are really influenced by our deep desire for our own autonomy, to be a law unto ourselves, not to have anyone tell us what we should do. And
Yeah.
so I think that there's all kinds of factors. There's emotional, there's value, there's experience, and there's intellectual, all at play in why we make the decisions that we do, including why we came to Jesus, right? Like, in
Yeah.
hindsight,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't come to Jesus because of apologetics. I came to Jesus because of people who really modeled him well, who I really wanted to be like. And if this is
Yeah.
the kind of person that Jesus made people into, that was evidence for me that it was true, but it wasn't a formal apologetic. And I would be deceptive and dishonest if I were to tell people that I'm a Christian because of those reasons. I'm actually a
Mm.
Christian because of some really lovely Christian people in my life who opened up my eyes and allowed me to hear the story because of who they were. I'm a Christian because of my parents and the
Mm.
church that I went to. Um, because I've also had very good experiences in the church. I don't relate to a lot of people who've had some really terrible experiences in the church. And sometimes when you read deconversion narratives, it's not hard. And this might sound judgmental, but it's not hard to see that there's more going on than intellectual reasons.
Mm.
Richard Dawkins, for example, has said not long ago, and you can find the clip on YouTube. He's being interviewed by Peter Boghossian, who used to be at Portland State University, and he's a sort of a philosopher and a gender studies guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he says to Richard Dawkins, what would cause you to believe in the existence of God? And Richard Dawkins says, I used to think that if I heard a big booming voice out of heaven that said, I am God, and then I saw Jesus coming back in the second coming, that I would believe. But I don't think that anymore. In fact, I think it's more likely that I would probably be having a hallucination. And so therefore, there is no evidence that could ever persuade me that God exists. So he at least is as transparent and honest
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that
I guess.
this
Yeah,
is
it's
not
true.
an evidence issue. This
Yeah.
is a deep heart issue. I interviewed another guy who was identified as a Christian and left the faith, and I said to him, "Well, what would cause you to believe in God again?" And he said, "If God ripped open the sky and I saw him, then I would believe. And I said, great. I said, but would you submit to him as your creator and as the Lord of your life? And he said, this is his direct quote, he said,
Yeah.
hell no.
Wow.
And he said, because nobody has the right to tell me what to do, what to eat, who to have sex with, where I can live, how I should behave. And my response to him was, well, then you should thank God that he does not give you that direct evidence, because then you will actually be more damnable, because it is clear that your refusal to believe in God isn't intellectual at all. It's deeply rooted in your desire for autonomy.
Yeah.
So there's lots going on underneath. And so I think that I need to ask myself, when I'm saying, man, I'm really deconstructing my faith, why am I doing this? Am I doing it because culture has instilled in me this impulse to really rethink what I believe? Has it instilled in me certain values that don't line up with our modern moral sensibilities?
Yeah.
And so I'm feeling this tension. And if so, which one of those needs to change? My values that have been formed, or the what Scripture teaches, or at least I think teaches.
Yeah.
All of those things, I think, play such a significant role in why we deconstruct and rethink, and why also people leave, and why people come to faith as well. So I think it's best if you can think through this as much as you can, and not just deceive yourself into thinking that this is just an intellectual endeavor that's brought you to the faith because you've just weighed the evidence so clearly.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like that almost then becomes a part of your guide for your like deconstructing and hopefully rebuilding, right? Where if you understand your motives, you're like, yeah, wait, they're not all these logical problems I just need to solve, right? Then you can, maybe that's a portion of it for you, and you can direct some energy and efforts towards that endeavor, but then also knowing that there's this other direction that you need to like have maybe some hard questions, or have some people in your life that you talk to about and kind of wrestle through with them versus just those facts, I would say.
Yeah. And I think that the first thing that in any deconstruction, like not a deconversion, but a deconstruction, this is the person who says, hey, I came out of this environment, I really am wrestling with it. It's so maybe unloving, or it just seems so narrow, or so strict, or so lacking in concern for the poor, something like that.
Yeah.
I think the two fundamental questions that anyone needs to ask in that is, am I willing to submit to the lordship of Jesus regardless of what he says? And two, what is my view of the Bible as far as an authority in my life? What am I going to do with that? Because if you are not willing to submit to the lordship of Jesus, then you don't really have Christianity. You have sort of a self-styled religion that you've tacked Jesus's sort of name onto. Now, not everybody submits to the lordship of Jesus perfectly, of course, but it should be the desire of our heart. And then the next question, and this is a really tricky one, is, what do I think about the Bible as far as the authority? Is it the final authority in my life that I submit to when I think I've understood it as best as I can?
Yeah.
Or am I going to say, the Bible teaches this, but no, I can't sign off on that? And if you say no to either of those questions, Jesus is not ultimately the Lord I submit to, and no, the Bible is not my final authority as best as I understand it, because you can always learn more about the Bible and come up with different interpretations of the Bible. But once you come up with what you think it says, are you willing to submit to it? If you say no to that, then you're probably heading for either a deconstruction that will not land in historic Orthodox Christianity, or you'll end up deconverting altogether. One of those two.
It's so interesting you say that. When our lead pastor, Mark White, he's often said to me at least, feelings will often try to trump facts if we're not very careful, and I imagine that is part of the particular challenge of both of those questions is, if I don't get the answer I want to hear, if I'm not told the right thing, or if I don't want to believe a part of the Bible, then that emotion can easily trump whether it actually is the authority for your life.
Yeah. And an example that comes to mind is a friend of mine who I grew up with, who no longer identifies as a Christian. She went on mission trips. She worked at the Bible camp. Like we had a very similar upbringing. But when I asked her what started it for her, it was that she said that the church that we came from was fairly traditional, leaning towards a bit, maybe a little bit fundamentalist, and was complementarian, and so women weren't preaching, and she had a really hard time with that. She said, "Look, I'm as smart as these guys. I'm more dedicated than many of the guys in our church, and yet they're allowed to get up and publicly talk, and I'm not. Well, I don't that. Well, that's a hard issue, right? That's not an intellectual issue. That is not submitting yourself to the authority of the Bible. Now, if she would have said, hey, I struggle with this, does God really mean that? And then she went to the text and then honestly as she could, came to an interpretation that was more egalitarian.
Yeah.
I think that there's certainly room for that, right? I'm not saying that I'm not saying I have, and this is the right interpretation of things, but hers wasn't that. It was I don't accept this, because if that's what the Bible says, then I don't accept it, and never even looked into pursuing maybe different understandings of the text. Now, I don't think all understandings are the same, and I'm not saying it's a pick and choose. You can just become egalitarian just because that's where your heart is moving you. That's where I think we have to be really careful and say, yeah, I'd love to be egalitarian, but I have to really first do my due diligence to understand what the text actually is teaching. And if it opens it up for that, then I can move in that direction. But if it doesn't, and I'm forcing it, then that's where I think the problem comes, and Scripture stops being the final authority. Now, we all do this to varying degrees, right? I'm not trying to say that we are all, you're either pure or you're not pure when it comes to your intent to submit to the authority of Scripture. But at least it should be the guiding conscious principle of our engagement with the text.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, you used the example in your book about the Jenga tower, right? Or I really like the example, even though it's like a tragic story of the temple in Jerusalem, where or they're building in Jerusalem, where they removed a pillar and then it collapsed because they didn't replace it. And I think that story illustrates that really well. Of there was this pillar of faith, there was this element of Christianity that maybe you took away, and instead of like fixing it, finding the right pillar, reinforcing it, maybe it's a different colored one, whatever like example you want to use or metaphor, and then putting it back before you continue on in your process. Like, that's a key element to deconstruction. Like, don't try to take care of everything at once, but do one thing at a time so that you can actually, I don't know what the right word is, but you can actually repair your faith in a way that's honest and genuine.
Yeah, if you pull too many Jenga blocks out of the tower too quickly without putting another Jenga block in place, the whole thing will eventually collapse. But if a Jenga block represents like maybe a belief or a practice or a value that you've grown up with in the church, if you pull that out and say, look, I really need to rethink this, right? Like, I'm going to rethink LGBTQ, or I'm going to think egalitarian complementarian, or I'm going to think eternal conscious torment, or I'm going to think limited atonement, or any of those kinds of things. Yeah, I think that before Jesus and under his lordship, I think that that's a healthy thing to do, to say, if I have Jesus's ultimate authority, and he's the ultimate, and I'm submitting to his word as the sort of practical authority in my life, then yes, I think you can pull these Jenga blocks out, look at them, compare with the text, and say, okay, this is what I've come to, Jesus. Before you, this is what I think. I could be wrong, so I'm going to hold it fairly loosely, but I'm going to try and submit to your lordship because I believe this is what your word teaches. The block doesn't look the same as when I pulled it out, but I'm putting it back into the tower of my faith. Yeah. But if you start pulling them out too quickly and not replacing them with a different block, then yes, the whole tower will eventually collapse.
Yeah. Well, that was part one of my conversation with Dr. John Marriott. And I think the process that John outlined for responding to someone who talks to you about deconstructing their faith is so powerful. Beginning that process with just thanking them and then truly listening to what they have to share. Now, tune into next week's episode for part 2, where we're going to talk about my personal favorite chapter in the book, which was all about understanding how our own values affect how we see God and the Bible, and how those values might differ in our priorities from somebody else. Now, if you want to learn more about John or buy his book, check out the show notes and the description of this episode. For more resources on deconstruction, make sure to check out Permission to Deconstruct on our YouTube channel, and head over to our resource page for more resources. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.